Hello, comrade. Looks a little bit communist, doesn't it? The red star? What's that about? Whiskey made for the people, by the people? Welcome back, whiskey fans. Today we're looking at another budget economy dram. But, as always, cheap whiskey doesn't have to be bad whiskey. You can get some really good value stuff if you look at the lower end of the market. I was going to say now more than ever you can get some really good cheap stuff, but that's crap. I'm not saying that. You could get some really, really good whiskey for not very much money at all in the 1980s and probably the 90s as well. But there's still value to be had if you look at the lower end of the Scotch market. And I think this is one of them, to be honest. And this is something that I've seen for years and years, and I've just walked past it and ignored it. And I've finally given it a try. And I think if you're looking for something that's really good value for money and a little bit on the cheap side, I think you probably should too. And something that I didn't actually realise after seeing this many times is this is actually a blended malt. Glendower. This is, you can get it in Iceland, here in the UK, and probably various other places. It's not exclusive to Iceland, but this is a blended malt. It says so underneath Glendower. Glendower is not a distillery. This is actually made by John Mclaren and Sons. So being a blended malt Scotch whisky, this is going to be malt whisky from more than one distillery blended together with no grain whisky at all. So it's a more premium product than your blended whiskies in theory, like your Johnny Walkers and your Famous Grouse and your Bells and your Chivas and Grants and all of those things. It should be a better product and a better experience because we've not got any grain whisky in there. And grain whisky doesn't have to be awful, but in my experience, and I think probably a lot of people experience, when you're looking at blended Scotch, it tends to be the crappy grain whisky that they pad them out with that drags the whole thing down. So this stuff here, Glendower, it used to be available with age statements. I think there was an 8-year-old and some others. This one, the widely available one that you can get now, it's a no age statement whisky. It's a NAS. So all we know is that every component in here is at least 3 years old. Is it chill filtered? Almost certainly. It is pretty clear. You can see the labels on the board through that. I quite like that as the benchmark test. If you can see which label is which through the bottle, then that means it's probably chill filtered. Is it artificially coloured? A little bit psychological there. Because we're dealing with a cheap whiskey, I automatically grabbed that and tried to undo the screw top. It's not a screw top, it's a cork. But is it artificially coloured? Probably a little bit. It's not too bad, it's not White and Mackay level. But it's probably darker than what you'd expect from a 3, 4, 5-year-old blended malt. So yeah, it's probably a little bit in there, but not the worst offender that we've ever seen. So I bought this one largely because I realised that it's a blended malt, and in my experience I think you quite often get really good value when you're going for cheap whiskey, when you go for the blended malts. And to be honest, it's been quite hot here lately in the UK. I'm not going to say too hot because I'm not going to be one of those people that bring winter on and we have 3 years of winter because everyone starts complaining. I don't mind it when it's hot, but it has been hot, and I wanted something nice and light and summery, perhaps that I could sip but also have in a mixed drink because it's quite affordable, and I thought this would fit the bill. As for price, here in the UK, even including its wonderful premium box that has the horrible hole in it that means that it doesn't protect anything, even including this premium box, I paid the princely sum of, I think it's £17, might have been £17.99, something like that, well under 20 quid. So it doesn't have to give us much to be worth what we paid for it, in my opinion. So there is a time and a place for economically produced, low price point whiskies. And I've said it before, there are, especially when you look at the cheap blended malts, there are whiskies out there that more than fulfill their purpose and give you more back than what you pay for them. So hopefully this is going to be another one of them. So Glendower from John Mclaren and Sons from Glasgow, Scotland. I'll show you the label. Some ridiculous tasting notes on the back there. I always make it a point not to read the tasting notes because 9 times out of 10 they're absolute BS. But Glendower blended malt on the nose. So the first thing that I get on the nose from this one is a lovely sweet maltiness, lovely sweet barley sugar notes, and to be fair, it has got some youth in it. There's definitely some young malt in there. It could do with a few more years, and there's probably some economical, slightly tied casks as well. But all in all, some lovely, nice barley sugar notes in there, sweet barley sugar, blueberry, some watery honey notes. It's actually, and I mean this in a good way, but it's slightly reminiscent of a good whiskey liqueur. Some nice appley notes. Apple and apple peel reminds me of something like perhaps a little bit of a knockoff Linkwood or young Glenfiddich. It's actually not a million miles away from Glenfiddich 12. Nice effervescent bright maltiness. If anyone out there, I'm sure a lot of you had, if you've had like young unpeated Bunnahabhain with that really bright appley malty character that Bunnahabhain has without the sherry and the peat, it's a little bit like that. So for a blended malt, as we often see with the cheap blended malts, you're getting lots of maltiness, not a lot else. They obviously can't afford to put expensive casks in this. They're not going to pay like £600 for a European oak sherry butt for this. They're just not going to. They're not even going to pay for an ex-red wine cask for this. It's going to be standard bourbon casks and probably not first fill. But that's okay. You can definitely smell there's a bit of slightly bitter dry oak on this. But again, that's okay, because we paid £17 for this. And mostly, it's very pleasant. So let's see how it tastes. Without a shadow of a doubt, it is slightly thin, especially on the arrival. You can tell that this bottle is 6/10 water. Because it is. There's more water than whiskey in the bottle. Sadly, but when you're paying well under £20, that's what you get. So slightly thin, but still quite nice and sweet. There's definitely some nice sweet barley sugar malty notes in there. Musty blueberry, slight grassiness. You can tell that it's got that kind of singleton blend filler note to it, but it's probably a little bit better than that. I would rather have this for £17-18 than whatever they're charging for singleton 12-year-old these days, which is probably close to twice that much. Very sweet malt. You can tell that it's an all malt production. No grain whiskey in this at all, and it really, really shows. You wouldn't get anything like this from your average blended Scotch whiskey, not this flavour profile. All about the the fruity, sweet, malty notes. Apple, banana, a little bit of a dry maltiness mixed with some of that bitter oakiness that I described on the nose. Actually, not that much in the way of immaturity. I don't think that this is an immature whiskey at all. It tastes like a finished product. It tastes like an economically produced, finished product that's been made by people that know what they're doing. You can definitely tell that it's not old though. A little bit of a chalky bitterness late on the palate. Again, possibly shows that the casks used in this have been a little bit tired, kind of economy casks, and I always think that with a low strength production that's really highlighted. But lots of nice, juicy, fruity, malty, sweet flavours in there to be had. As for the finish, let's have another little sip and have a look at the finish. Certainly a little bit on the watery side. There's definitely the sense to this that it's had a little bit too much of a reduction. I imagine if you got something like Compass Box Orchard House and watered it down too much, it might taste a little bit like this. I don't know who John Mclaren are getting their casks from, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is something like Linkwood in this. It is definitely slightly inferior, but in the same ballpark as Compass Box Orchard House. On the finish, lots of malty notes, malty, slightly spicy. I think that it's a proper traditional Highland style, but really in an economy presentation. So, as always with these economy presentations, because it's a cheap whiskey, it's a very, very affordable whiskey, and it's a low strength whiskey which kind of goes hand in hand with that low price point. I think that how much you get out of this, it really depends on how much you put in to a certain extent. If you're necking this in a bar setting and you're just pouring it into a tumbler and slinging it back, you're not going to get a lot out of this. It's not going to be any better than any other blended Scotch. But I have found that if you put a little bit of warmth into this, and as I've said before, with low strength whiskies, if you do what everyone that's buying this stuff doesn't, and you actually hold it on your tongue for that little bit longer, let it mix with your saliva, let it heat up, let those aromas expand and open up, you do get rewarded with a better experience. And I do think that this Glendower, this £17 whiskey, it is pretty rewarding if you do that, and it's not actually as anemic as most 40%ers. I would say that it's kind of just about on par with like the 43% Flora and Fauna releases. It's really not that far behind at all, which for £17 is really rather good. Of course, the other way, and probably the more common way to get more flavour out of low strength drams like this, is to take bigger sips, to knock it back, to fill your mouth and overpower your palate, which of course just means that you're drinking more than you would otherwise in a shorter amount of time than you would otherwise, which is why I've said before that low strength spirits and tax and duty that are linked to ABV actually work against public health. Just my opinion, but if you ask me, low strength spirits, and especially mixed drinks and things like that, that is where the problem is. With this whiskey though, this Glendower blended malt, I think this really continues that theme of mine of value in blended malts. I think that if you're going to go for a cheap whiskey, bypass your cheap, like your really cheap blended scotches, forget all of those, and get yourself some of the cheaper blended malts. And if you're a malt enthusiast that's perhaps helping someone get into single malt whiskey, I think this is a really good one to start off with, because it's got some really good flavours in there. It's very approachable, very, very affordable, and it kind of gives a little glimpse of what can be really fantastic about single malt without breaking the bank. I think in comparison, when you look at your blended scotches, like your famous grouse and things like that, your blended Scotch, they're often cheap for a reason, or if they're well made, they can be quite overpriced. And a very well made premium blended Scotch, the price can often creep up to the point where it's sort of competing with and even eclipsing the more affordable single malts. Blended malts, on the other hand, in my opinion, they offer a really good minimum quality without getting too expensive. The nose on this one, though. For such a cheap whiskey, it smells fantastic. And quite nostalgic as well, I think. Anyone that's been in whiskey for kind of 15, 20 plus years, I think nosing this, it kind of takes you back to a slightly simpler time in whiskey. I think a lot of blends used to smell like this. They used to have this very spirit-driven, malt-driven profile rather than all being very cask-heavy. In the old days, before when first fill something was always the default answer to improving a whiskey, or rather masking the profile of a whiskey, this is kind of more of the thing that we used to get more of back then. It's probably also a reflection of the rising grain character in a lot of blended Scotch these days, that we don't get as much of this. So, yeah, Glendower, non-age statement blended malt whiskey. I think it's well worth £17. It's a nice little affordable whiskey. It's not going to blow anyone away, but I think it's really great value for money, in the same vein as your Lidl's Glenorchy and your Shackleton and your Morrison's Distiller's Choice. It's a really great guard whiskey or a social dram. If you're looking for something that's reasonably decent that can be sipped, but something that you're maybe also going to use as a mixer, this is a really good one. And it's definitely, in my opinion, better than a lot of your budget blends, and even your sort of low and middle tier, price tier blends, like your entry Johnny Walkers and your Black Bottle and your Famous Grouse, whilst this costs a similar amount or perhaps even a little bit less. And as I said before, really great low-cost alternative to something simple like Glenfiddich 12 or Linkwood. Hope you've enjoyed this one, and hopefully I can point a few of you towards this one if you're looking for something cheap and cheerful, because I think this one ticks all of those boxes. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Cheers.